In our last few videos, we've been looking at solving quadratic equations. And we've been developing this process, kind of a step-by-step process of what is the best way to solve a quadratic equation. And we saw if there's no bx term, isolate x squared plus or minus square root. If there is a bx term, we followed a step-by-step process here, getting equal to 0, keeping the ax squared term positive just to make it easier. Divide out and completely cancel any common numbers as long as we don't create fractions. And then factor out any common variables. And that we had to keep. We had to keep that x or that t or whatever the variable was. That was one of our factors and gave us a solution. And then we had a couple of videos on factoring with the coefficient of a equal to 1, so just x squared, and then how to factor if a is not equal to 1. And we looked at two methods there, the guess and check method and the what I call the AC method with factoring by grouping. What we're going to look at in this video is what do we do if it does not factor? Because notice this word here, try. Not all, that doesn't even look like try. Let's rewrite that. Not all quadratic equations will factor. If the solutions are rational numbers, in other words, can be written as a fraction, 2/3, 7, -14, etc. If those are what our x is equal, then the quadratic would have factored. But if the quadratic equation will not factor, we're going to use something called the quadratic formula. If the equation is written in the form ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0, the a is the coefficient of the x squared, the b is the coefficient of the x, and c is the constant. If we were to do a process called completing the square with the a, b, and c, we would end up with a quadratic formula. And what the quadratic formula is for a quadratic function, a quadratic equation, ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0, the solutions, the values of x that if I plug in would make it a true statement, are negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2 times a. And notice my plus or minus here. That's the same as that plus or minus square root that we used when we didn't have a b term. That's how we're going to end up with two different solutions. You need to memorize this formula. You need to commit it to memory. We're going to use it a lot the rest of the semester, so make sure that you have that memorized and know how to use it. Let's look at a couple of examples. Let's say that I have an equation that looks like this, and my instructions say solve, and remember solve just means find the value or values of x that make the equation a true statement if I were to plug x in. So let's say we have 3x squared is equal to 5x minus 1. So if I look at this equation, I know it's a quadratic equation because it has the x squared as its highest term. It is an equation because it has an equal sign, doesn't have an f of x or a y. So the only thing I can do is find the value or values of x that if I plug in make this a true statement. Because it's quadratic, because it has an exponent of 2, I'm thinking I probably have two different solutions. It does have a bx term, so I know that I need to get this equal to 0, keeping the ax term positive. So I subtract the 5x, I add the 1, And remember, when I bring these across to the other side, it changes the sign. If you are still writing minus 5x plus 1 on both sides, see if you can start kind of working away from doing that and not doing that. I'm thinking it's going to be confusing you at this point. So just work on bringing to the other side, changing the sign. Then our next step is to look, do I have any common numbers? 3, -5, 1. There is no number that's common to all of those, so I can't do that step. Then I look at my variables. Do I have an x in every term? And I do not, so I cannot do that. But get in the habit of mentally checking those steps before you move on to factoring or using the quadratic formula. If I were to try to factor this, I'm just going to use the guess and check method very quickly here. I'm thinking that the only way I can have 3x squared is 3x times x. The only way I can have plus 1 when I have a minus here is minus 1 minus 1. That's the only way I can end up with plus 1 for my number here. And if I quickly FOIL that back out, my outer and inner terms, I get negative 3x minus 1x, which is negative 4x. And that is not equal to the middle term I have here. So that tells me that does not work. But if it did work, if that factoring did work, then that would have been a very quick and easy way of doing it. So I always want to try factoring first, always. We're going to end up solving a lot of quadratic equations in the next few sections. And if you can factor, that's going to be by far the quickest, easiest way. So make sure that you can factor. But this one did not work. So now we know that we need to use the quadratic formula. So my first step is to write down the formula from memory. I need to identify what A is, what B is, and what C is. And it's important that you actually write those down. Don't just put a little A above each one or a B or whatever. You're going to lose your signs, your negatives, and you're going to be confused. So go ahead and write what A is. A is 3, B is -5, and C is +1. And then it's just a matter of plugging those numbers into the formula and simplifying. I want you to go ahead and put each of these numbers, the A, the B, and the C, in place of the letters in the formula, and then simplify what's under the square root. Go ahead and do the multiplication, the squaring, the subtraction, etc. And I want you to try to see if you can do this without using a calculator. It's going to be important for you to be able to have these mathematical skills without just plugging it in the calculator. So go ahead and do that, and then we'll look at simplifying and writing the final answer. Pause the video, get to that point, turn the video back on. All right, so we see that x is going to be equal to a negative, and that's this negative here, -5. Because b is -5, we have two negatives there. Then our plus minus, then our square root, and then our -5 squared minus 4 times a times c. All over, and be sure that you bring this division line all the way across. 2 times a, and then I simplify. -5 is +5, plus or minus the square root. And be careful here. If you're using your calculator and you plug in -5 squared on your calculator just like that, it's going to tell you it's -25. And we know that that's not what we want. That's wrong. So if you absolutely insist on using your calculator, be sure to put a parenthesis around that so you get the positive 25. Otherwise, you're going to end up with an error. All right, so negative 5 squared is 25, minus 4 times 3 times 1 is 12, all over 6. So we have 5 plus or minus the square root. 25 minus 12 is 13, all over 6. Now, we need to do a couple of things at this step. We need to look at the number under the radical and see if it has a perfect square that we can simplify. And in this case, we do not. 13 is prime. We also need to look and see if we can do any canceling, numerator and denominator. And we have a 5 and a 6, so we cannot. We also have to keep in mind we cannot cancel anything that's under the radical with anything down here. It has to be outside of the radical to cancel. So this is completely simplified, but we do need to keep in mind that we have two separate answers. We have 5 minus the square root of 13 over 6, and we have 5 plus the square root of 13 over 6. And this is two different irrational answers, but they are solutions. If I were to take either one of these numbers, this is a single number here, if I were to take that number and plug it in for x here and here, work it out, I would get a true equation. Same thing with this one. So we have two different solutions. Let's look at another one. All right, so let's say we have this equation. 6x squared plus 22x equals negative 10. I want you to run through the first several steps. Let's look back at our steps here. I want you to run through the first several steps here. Looking for the b term. We do have a b term. Getting it equal to 0. Dividing out any common numbers. Factoring out any common variables. And then try to factor. I want you to do all of those things. Pause the video and then turn the video back on. All right, we see we do have a b term, so we get it equal to 0, keeping the x squared term positive. Then we look for any common numbers, and we see these are all even numbers, so I can completely divide out a 2. I don't have to keep that 2. It is divided out. It is gone. And you see how now my numbers are much smaller, and it's going to be much easier to do the rest of the arithmetic moving forward. So always, always divide out as long as you do not create fractions. You never want to create fractions. Divide out any common numbers. Now I'm going to try to factor this real quickly, and I'm going to use the guess and check method. The only way I can get 3x is 3x and x. The only way I can get positive 5 when I have a positive here is plus 1 or plus 5. Or it could be the other way around with the 5 first and the 1 second. And then checking my middle term, I have 15x plus x is 16x. That does not work, so that can't be the factorization. Then I have 3x plus 5x is 8x. That also does not work. So it does not factor. The only two factorizations that could have worked to give me the 3x squared here and the 5 here did not give me the 11x in the middle. but it's always worth trying to factor pretty quickly before you move to the quadratic formula. All right, so now we see we do need to use the quadratic formula. What I'd like you to do is to write down the quadratic formula, and at some point you need to be doing this from memory. At this point you probably are going to look back in your notes, but be working towards writing the quadratic from memory. Write what A is, literally write A equals, B equals, C equals. Write what those numbers are, plug all the numbers in, and then work on simplifying it. And then I will jump in at the end and help you with the simplifying and the rewriting. Go ahead and pause the video and work as far as you possibly can with this one, and then turn the video back on. All right, we see that A is 3, B is 11, and C is 5. So we write our quadratic formula. Negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. And then I plug in my numbers. So we have negative 11 plus or minus the square root of 11 squared, which is 121, minus, let's see, 12 times 5 is 60, all over 6. So I have negative 11 plus or minus the square root of 121 minus 60 is 61. All over 6, and 61 is prime, so I just write my two separate answers. And these answers are what are called exact answers. When I keep that radical in there and I'm not writing a decimal approximation, this is what's known as an exact answer. And for the most part, we're going to want an exact answer. When we get to the applications, we'll be using decimal approximations, but until then, keep that square root in there and give us an exact answer. All right, so that's a practice using the quadratic formula. Get it in standard form. Identify A, B, and C. Write down the quadratic formula on your paper, plug the numbers in, and then simplify. And please be sure to practice writing it as two separate answers, because we're going to need those two separate answers when we get to some later things we're going to do with these. In our next video, we're going to look at solving some equations that may not look like quadratic equations at first, but we can use some quadratic methods to solve them. So that's going to be our next lesson, quadratic